I'll introduce myself and my colleagues. My name is Tomás O'Leary. I'm the president of Free ICT. I'm here with my colleagues Jan, Abipo and Martin, and our very esteemed connection in the industry, Dan Sheffett. Our goal in Free ICT is really to promote. It's not necessarily to knock, it's to promote choice for businesses here in the European Union. It's to promote the positive aspects of the secondary market, the aftermarket, and the independent sector of that market. The reason for producing this report is really to bring it to the attention of legislators, of business, of the public in general, and to the press, naturally, while we're here today, to the benefits and importance of the independent sector, whether that be organizations who repair, fix, who are independent, whether that be technology, hardware technology or software technology, and also the whole myriad of organizations that support that infrastructure, whether they be brokers, software resellers, hardware resellers, that whole independent chain, and to establish actually how much of the market do they currently hold, and what are the sort of things that businesses and legislators need to think about to support that. Why should they support that market? And I'll talk again in a moment about some of that.
What I wrote here is that, of course, most of what we have here is hardware driven, and what we are very interested in our industry here, ICT, is mainly software or firmware. And the problem here is, of course, that it's becomes a bit complicated to use the same explanation, justification, or defenses that we have for imposing obligations on hardware manufacturers as doing the same for software. Just remind you that the justifications that we have for imposing these obligations on dishwashers, washing machines, and so on, I've written them down here, and they are getting down prices, third-party maintenance, and we also see that in the report, will have arguably have an effect on prices. It will also have an effect on quality. It will also have an effect on the speed of the intervention, on innovation, flexibility, customization, and job creation. Those are the points that I've taken from this report, and there is very interesting statistics in support of each of those, but they mainly seem to relate, at least directly, to the hardware industry. However, when it comes to job creation and when it comes to innovation, I think that these two arguments are maybe even stronger in the software environment. And that, of course, brings us to the major legal challenge that we have, because if we want to have a vibrant third-party maintenance alternative in the software industry, we are up against intellectual property rights. We need, and the directive that I just mentioned, the national legislation, does not attack that problem at all, but it needs to be addressed. We need to come up with a new paradigm for the limits of intellectual property rights. We need to come out with a new paradigm which is to a certain extent based on competition law, which this report also deals with. The fact that when you introduce software on the market, you are de facto enjoying a monopoly, because that is what the IP rights confers upon you. And to what extent can you leverage that monopolistic situation that law gives you onto the downstream market, which is the maintenance of your own product. So we have a competition law aspect here, and we have an intellectual property law aspect here. This is the major legal challenge that we will be facing, and I think that it will be driven by the internet, where we have open source already as an industry standard. We have APIs which allow application developers to access Android, as we spoke about before, and other programs. It may very well be that the law will be moving in that direction, like a common license, an obligation to license, if you enjoy this monopolistic situation that the intellectual property rights confers upon you. In any case, we have to address that problem. The challenge is overwhelming today because of the cost of switching. And this is what this report also says. If you start out with the mainframe, with mainframes operating on software by a certain company, it's impossible. It simply costs you too much to switch because you started working with them 20 years ago, and you have layers of those software programs which make it even impossible for the company in question to know what you actually have. So forget about switching. So this is kind of the thing, you become captive and there is no choice.
There's approximately 50,000 jobs currently at stake within our members' organizations, okay, and who we represent in the industry. That's a tremendous number of jobs at the moment, but the opportunity around that is even greater, which I'll talk about in a moment when I talk about the report. Our job in Free ICT is a couple of key jobs. One, we need to promote and support our members, okay, and to make sure that we're visible in the marketplace. We also, our job is to highlight where we see restrictive practices, where we see activity that manufacturers and publishers and large ICT players start to introduce restrictive practices that are not good for innovation, that are not good for business. We need to highlight those. That's good for those companies as well as it's good for the businesses, because what that will do is encourage innovation, not stagnation. Other things we're involved in are, for example, the EU free flow of data activity, because increasingly, as you've got connected devices, you potentially have restrictions over that. So we're trying to identify areas where potentially that could cause a problem for businesses. Clearly the WE Directive initiatives, we've been involved heavily in some of those over the last number of years. There's some standardization activity going on within Europe, as you may be aware, the JTC 10 activity around that area, around standardization, we're involved there. There's a potential scoring system, talk about repairability in the United States. There's a potential scoring system that's been discussed within Europe, where you have a repairability score similar to what you have in terms of energy ratings on systems, whether something is repairable or not. These are important considerations for businesses to understand. Green public procurement, another area of activity for us. And I guess in the overall European Union circular economy roadmap, we're heavily involved in that area. And these are really important things to have an alternative voice at the table. And it's important that this is publicized. The report, as you have in front of you, has some key highlights I'd just like to bring to your attention, mostly outlined in the summary. The principal one is obviously the size of the aftermarket. So we're not the only participants in the aftermarket. Clearly, aftermarket also includes the manufacturers and publishers as well in that area. It's estimated to be 46 billion. The numbers are in dollars, unfortunately, but it's $46 billion annually. The estimates that Deloitte have put on this is about 4 billion of this is accounted by independent organizations that we represent. This is actually quite a low percentage, and it should be an awful lot higher. So, and again, we believe the reason for this to be, even though it has been growing recently, which is great. I mean, we look at the two areas that are probably easier to measure: the data center repair market, independent repair for data center technology, service, storage, or the high-end equipment that sits in data centers is growing at around 10 to 15% per annum, depending on the metrics used and the analysts who've analyzed it. And a recent report by Gartner estimated the software support market is growing at over 33% per annum. So these are reasonably fast-growing markets, but they actually could grow a lot faster and could provide a lot more value. The variety of skills that exist within the independent sector are challenging for the primary markets to compete with. The multi-vendor support that's available from the independent sector is not currently available to the same extent from the primary sector. There's also clear evidence of clients of the OEMs and the major mega vendors that they are increasingly unsatisfied. Okay, this is come out in many reports already, and you only have to probably go to a handful of conferences, which I've just been on the conference circuit for the last 4 or 5 weeks. I've been around my family at home very much. I've been in the United States and been in Paris last week, and large ICT users are very unsatisfied with many of the services from some of the large vendors. And I think this is a clear point of benefit of the secondary market that needs to be emphasized. And by obviously having the choice and having an option to be able to use these, that's clear and unambiguous, will obviously improve the services that customers receive, but equally improve the services that are being offered by primary market, which is clearly important as well for everybody's benefit. There are some challenges, obviously the report has highlighted. One of the biggest challenges, particularly with complex technology, are the high switching costs. And both the users of the technology and the vendors in the technology space are very much aware of these challenges. It isn't always clear to legislators that these challenges exist. It is often that these are downplayed, that there's always an option to change, when clearly it just doesn't take somebody to be in IT for very long to understand actually that's not as often as easy as it sounds. So these high switching costs in particular segments of the industry. So these switching costs are being used to prevent organizations from being able to make those changes. And we see this regularly as well, and the report highlights it, is the complexity of the contracts, myriad of contracts, because of the lack of rules. And this is going back to what I said earlier, the lack of rules in the market around even simple things like contracts, licensing, for example. When some of the major manufacturers started to introduce licenses for some of their firmware, it became more complicated, more difficult to understand. It was different for different category of technology, for example. And this is a common theme where they almost deliberate complexity. We all experience this with our phones. When we download anything, we've got to accept the terms and conditions. How many of us have actually read every single line of every single thing we've accepted on our phones? And to put this in perspective, an additional 10 billion, so the 4 billion that's currently being occupied in these estimates by independent sector, if that was to increase by 10 billion more, that would, if at a 50% discount, would bring the 46 billion down to 41 billion. But the 220,000 jobs would increase to 320,000 jobs, with the vast majority, if not all of them, being here in Europe. So it's 100,000 additional jobs that could be created here within European, and particularly when you consider most of the organizations will be categorized as SME organizations at a European level. That's what I'd like to say about